In this episode, we'll be discussing the lowering of kingship, the significance of the Pinecone Handbag symbols, and the ancient teachers that traveled around the world to create civilizations. Could all of these teachers and symbols be connected back to ancient Sumer? We'll follow the evidence to find out. In the last episode, we talked about the symbols of the serpent and the eagle. This episode is going to expand on that and go deeper, explaining how this information connects to that and all plays the same role in understanding why our history went the way that it did. But the first place to start is to go back to the very beginning, to why things are the way they are. Where did all of this begin? And it begins what's known as the lowering of kingship in ancient Sumer. To understand this story, we have to travel back to ancient Sumer and return to the cuneiform tablets to understand where it all began with the lowering of kingship told to us through the ancient Sumerian King List, as well as the Uruk list of kings and sages, and numerous others that tell us that instead of this model of reality that we think of, with rulership disseminating down in a hierarchy, instead of that coming from the people, it was actually handed down by the Anunnaki gods. And they actually tell us that in the text. The Sumerian King List starts with when kingship was lowered from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. Now we return to the ancient city of Eridu where it all began. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad thing, because things always throughout our history seem to have started in more of a pure place. As I talked about in the last episode, the civilizations that were originally created from the Americas all the way through Asia were created based on balance and worshiping the stars and knowledge, but later they became corrupted. This same model also became corrupted, where this power structure ended up dominating, taking over all of the knowledge, and then keeping it from the rest of society. We find this unbalance of society being traced all the way back to the ancient Babylonian civilization, what's known as the Code of Hammurabi. Now in that text, it talks about Hammurabi as being divinely chosen to rule over the people. But there's a very specific thing that it states in there. It says that he ruled over the black-headed people. Now think for a second. In the last episode, I discussed the importance of symbolism and how the certain head that was shown on both the Anunnaki gods and certain kings represented their mentality and what they were passing along. So the serpent-headed figures that we find, like the Ubaid statue and numerous others, represented this passing of knowledge to civilizations. And we find the same thing in India with the Nagas, where it shows this serpent head with often 7 rays of sunshine or light, representing the 7 colors of visible light spectrum, passing knowledge. The reason why 7 is so important is that there are 7 colors in the visible light spectrum that exactly match the 7 colors of the chakra systems within us. Now remember also, the symbol of the eagle was shown on the head to pass knowledge of war and conquering. Now there's another one that we can talk about as well. This is the third symbol that's mentioned in numerous texts around the world, and it's shown through the meaning of the black-headedness of society. Now what does that mean? Returning to the Code of Hammurabi, discussing how it says that there was the black-headed people. The reason it says that is because Hammurabi has all the knowledge. He's the divine king chosen by the Anunnaki to rule over Babylon. But he states that he ruled over the black-headed people. Now what does that mean? What it means is very important because it's where we can trace back to history when this great division started. The division of when the knowledge was not disseminated to the people, but rather kept in the hierarchies of this kingship structure. That wasn't originally supposed to be like that. But just like all things, power became corrupted, and the individuals at the top decided to keep that power and knowledge all to themselves. And that's why in the Code of Hammurabi, it discusses the black-headed people that he rules over. And it means that the society all around them didn't have any knowledge. They didn't know anything. And that's why they're called black-headed, because it means they were empty of knowledge. This is something very important to understand, because it just shows you that these symbols and meanings around the world have been trying to tell us all along that this power structure was put into place. Now after Babylon, this only became more and more powerful, especially with the Roman Empire, where they would actually use gladiator games and violence to keep society focused in the wrong direction. All throughout history, this has been the direction we've gone, more and more knowledge has been kept in the hierarchical structure of this kingship at the very top, and less of it has made it to the rest of society. This is in order to control them, because they realize that if society had knowledge, that they would have power instead of them. And that's a very important thing to understand, because it means we've largely been tricked into focusing on the wrong parts of our reality, focusing on all these aspects of war and conflict, focusing on these aspects of competition with one another through various sports, which is just like a recreation of the great gladiator games of the Roman Empire. We must not lose our focus and remember that knowledge is power. That's how we regain the power that we've lost, in finding out the symbols and what they mean and taking back that power. Now let's go back to where that's shown in the best example. Besides the Code of Hammurabi, there are other places that these symbols have been shown in this kingship model of knowledge being passed to those at the very top. And the best example of that comes from the Ashurbanipal Library. If you remember from the first episode, I discussed how the Ashurbanipal Library was the greatest library ever discovered in history, even greater than the Library of Alexandria. And in the royal temple of Ashurbanipal, they found one of the most important murals and artifacts ever found throughout history. And this was known as the Assyrian Tree of Life. But it's not just depicting the Tree of Life that's shown around the world. It's showing something much more important. What it shows, in the center we find the Tree of Life, which is being honored by, on the left and the right side, a king and a priest. And on either side of them, we see these Anunnaki figures. Now remember, we always know the difference between one of these royal king and priests and the Anunnaki gods by the depictions of wings. Wings always represent an ascended and higher being. And in this case, we find two Anunnaki gods on either side of this king and priest. But that's very important to understand. If you look closely at that mural, you'll see that the king is depicted in such a way where he has the rod of rulership, and then we also find the priest next to him. This shows you how the kingship structure was organized. A king ruling over the people, and then a priest ruling over religion and spirituality. These were the two sides that became designed and woven into our entire structure here, and it hasn't changed ever since. Look at the power of the Vatican today, as well as the power of places like the United States and London, these three strange independent states that they exist outside the rest of the models of our world. That's the power structure that still exists today that hasn't changed. It's ruling over the rest of the people. Now, let's get back to the Ashurbanipal Library and the Assyrian Tree of Life mural. What it shows there, going deeper, really helps to understand and explain our entire reality. The king and the priest are standing on either side of the Assyrian Tree of Life, and on either side of them are these Anunnaki winged figures. Now they're passing knowledge, but specifically pointing the symbol of what's known as the pinecone to the back of their heads. This is one of the most important symbols in the world, besides the symbol of the serpent and the eagle. Now what the pinecone represents is the passing of knowledge, the seeds of knowledge. It shows that they were passing certain knowledge to the king and the priest on either side. Now today, if you go to the Vatican, you'll see a gigantic statue of a pinecone sitting out in front. It's right there in front of us all along. It shows you that that power structure and control of knowledge was being kept within those organizations. Now there's another symbol that's next to them that's also very important to understand. On each side of the king and a priest, these Anunnaki figures are not only passing the pinecone to them, but they also have something in their hand. This has been shown as a type of handbag or anything related to keeping something secret. So what does that mean? It means that the pinecone, the knowledge that they're passing, the seeds of knowledge to create kingship and the structure for all of society, all of that knowledge, the totality of all of it, is held by these Anunnaki figures. And the handbag represents the place where it's all kept, the secret place where all the knowledge is. So the pinecone can almost be thought of as a symbol that comes out of the handbag that's being used to pass knowledge. But remember, some of them are shown with the eagle heads, others with serpent heads, or others just with human-like heads. That matters because it's telling you what kind of knowledge they're passing. In some cases, it's the knowledge of how to create a civilization in balance, to worship the stars, understand balance, and how to reach higher states of ascension by building ancient temples and such. Whereas the other symbol represents how to create a powerful empire and to create a structure of war to conquer and dominate the others. These were the two sides of what created the conflict within our reality. Now, where else do we find these symbols around the world? The symbols of the Pinecone Handbag are perhaps the most common symbols we find in ancient civilizations around the world, besides the serpent, dragon, and eagle and phoenix, because it represents the other side of this entire conversation and understanding of our reality. And what this means is that those symbols, when they're present in those civilizations, are telling us a story. Just like the platform of the eagle and jaguars are telling us a story about the serpent dragon god, Kukulkan, and then this Nergal figure, this god El figure that's the eagle, this is also telling a story. Where do we see that? All throughout the Fertile Crescent, from Sumer, Akkadian, and Babylon, we see numerous depictions of the Pinecone Handbag. It's literally in almost every piece of art we can find. That's why in ancient cuneiform tablets, it's discussed how kingship was lowered to that region first, before anywhere else in the world. Because that's where it started. That's where the knowledge was passed down to create these hierarchical structures. But that power became corrupted. But before it did, we find pure forms of that all around the world. Starting in Sumer in the Fertile Crescent, traveling north from ancient Sumer and the first pre-Diluvian cities, we get to the region known as the Anatolia region of Turkey, where we find this ancient temple site of Göbekli Tepe. And on those T-shaped pillars, we find the very same symbol of the handbags on gigantic T-shaped pillars as part of a celestial library, showing us that the knowledge that was passed to them to understand the precession of the equinoxes, the constellations, and the balance that exists in the universe and the heavens was given to them by the Anunnaki. We also find that next door at a nearby site where during a road excavation only a few years ago, they found an ancient statue known as the Urfa Man. The Urfa Man is showing the same symbology that we find around the world. We find this obsession over the passing of knowledge and balance, as well as the fertility symbols in ancient symbols nearly everywhere. Now, besides Göbekli Tepe and the pillars that show the handbags, we also see in other parts of the world as well. In the Olmec civilization near Veracruz, Mexico, we find gigantic statues where it shows the passing of knowledge through the handbag in those depictions. The same thing, thousands and thousands of miles away. It all came from ancient Sumer, showing us that there are teachers and guides that seem to have traveled around the world. Nearby in the Toltec civilization, we find the very same thing. This depiction of handbags and the passing of knowledge and what's known as the Toltec warriors, that were originally called the Atlantean warriors, which we'll get more into that civilization and its origins in later episodes. Now that we've discussed the symbols of the Pinecone Handbag, let's talk about the other influences we find around the world and how this all relates to these ancient Anunnaki gods. What we find is that when we study the original gods that led to the creation of these civilizations and the depictions they left of them all around the world, we find nearly the same thing. Looking all the way from the Maya of Mexico and the Aztec and Toltec and Olmec, down through South America and the pre-Inca, we find the same depictions of this being that traveled throughout that entire region and created those civilizations that were later corrupted. Now, starting up in the Maya, many may know that that creator god, the god that passed the knowledge of those civilizations originally, was known as Kukulkan. Now, Kukulkan is shown depicted as a serpent feathered dragon god, connecting back to the ancient symbols of Enki and Thoth. The most important thing to understand here is that just like secret societies emerged around the world to protect this knowledge, we also found great sages and teachers that would go around and create civilizations. Now, it doesn't just mean that it was one being responsible for everything, but rather let's think of it as a group of beings that would travel around, and that's exactly how they're described. Kukulkan isn't described as being on his own alone. He's described as being with several other teachers, and they would travel around and create civilizations. But that being, this being of Kukulkan, shown as the feathered serpent dragon god, is the very same thing we find in the Aztec. This depiction of Quetzalcoatl is nearly identical. It shows that it's the same being, which means they traveled throughout that region and created the civilizations, and then they left. And that leaving is important to understand. As we continue to travel around the world and discuss the similarities of these gods, we're going to return to why the departing of them was so important towards how the outcome went. So as we continue south, we get into the area of South America with Peru and Bolivia. And what we find is that the god there, known as Viracocha, was also a dragon serpent god. Many people are taught in school that the name America originated from an Italian explorer, but that's not true at all. We know that because if we go to the earliest depictions of these gods and the original name of that region, it meant Amaruca, land of the feathered serpents, which makes sense when we look at how Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha were all feathered serpent dragon gods. Now remember, having feathers in this case represents the metamorphosis of the serpent into its highest form, the dragon, showing that these were ascended master teachers that were traveling through and creating those civilizations. What it tells us is that the entire region of North and South America was the great heart of the serpent dragon civilizations of the world. And that comes into play later on when we discuss how they were conquered. But before we do that, let's travel around the world and discuss other areas and other gods that have the same descriptions and the same comparisons. Returning to the Fertile Crescent region, the area that's today known as Iran, we find another god there known as Ahura Mazda that has the exact same depictions and descriptions as Enki. Now remember, Enki's original symbol is the serpent and dragon. That's where it all began. In fact, that's why the ancient city of Eridu, the first city mentioned where kingship was lowered to, in fact, the first city ever created on Earth, that's why that site has been so demonized by archaeologists. Sadly today, that city of Eridu has been left abandoned in the deserts of Iraq. When we look at the history books, we find that Oxford University and Iraq archaeologists visited that region in the late 1800s and found Eridu. They started excavating the main part of the city, but ignored the ziggurat. Later on, in the 1940s, up to 1948, they went back to the site, took pictures, and found ancient tablets, and since then, have never returned. What's more disturbing about that is that the most important part of that site, known as the Ziggurat of Eridu, has never been excavated by archaeologists. In fact, that location, the location of Eridu and Uruk, is the greatest conspiracy in my mind of any archaeological sites in the world. They've been completely abandoned, especially Eridu, have been left in the desert, and photos that you can find online show people actively looting it and selling those artifacts on the black market. None of this is a coincidence. Clearly, because that was the original patron city of the god Enki, and thinking about how Enki became demonized by Christianity to be the evil serpent, Satan and Lucifer, it all makes sense. This was his original city and the most sacred city to him. So is it any coincidence that this ancient site, the patron city of Enki, has been left abandoned in the desert to looters and never excavated by archaeologists besides the small part of the North City, the Ziggurat Temple of Enki, where all of the artifacts, the cuneiform tablets, still remain? Another really interesting fact to point out to prove the age of that city is that those pictures that have been shown to us from those looters have given us one thing that's positive. They show us that on the Ziggurat Temple, the mountain that's been eroding, where the original temple was thousands and thousands of years ago, is covered in seashells. Now think for a moment that what the tablets discuss, as well as ancient biblical stories, that there was a great deluge that destroyed all of those cities and civilizations. And these seashells are remnants of that great catastrophe when tsunamis swept through the land and destroyed nearly everything. This shows you that these depictions that are found in the cuneiform tablets describing the age of the cities existing well over 13,000 years ago is accurate, and that history is largely being covered up. The struggle for Eridu is being taken on by only a few individuals in the world. I am one of those people that has openly discussed my anger over Eridu in the hope that one day it can be preserved and we won't lose all of these ancient artifacts. But that future is up to the society and whether or not they care enough to push this control system of history and the mainstream archaeologists to actually look into the truth of our past. There are other parts of the world where we find these same shared gods and the influence that they had on them. And one of my favorite stories, and the areas that shows the most comparisons to ancient Sumer in the Americas, is a culture called the Dogon of Mali, Africa. Now, the Dogon of Mali, Africa, are one of the most fascinating stories of one's studies, because what you find is that they had knowledge that seemed to be impossible at the time. In the 1930s, French anthropologists visited this remote tribe in Mali, Africa, only to discover that they had more knowledge than all astronomy at the time. They not only knew details about our entire solar system, but they knew details of a star constellation known as Sirius, with a star known as Sirius A, B, and C. The most fascinating thing about that is that Sirius C hadn't even been discovered yet, and they already knew its orbital description. They had all these details that seemed to be impossible with a primitive culture. But what's interesting about that is you learn where the Dogon actually got that information. They describe how there was a being that told them that was known as the Nommo. When we look in the descriptions of the Nommo, we find that it's the exact same depiction that we find further east in Sumer in ancient Fertile Crescent, showing us that Enki and his group of teachers like Thoth had simply been traveling around the world, passing down the knowledge to create those civilizations. Now, the other area that's fascinating to connect this to prove that these influences were shared all around the world, is the Olmec. When we look into the Olmec civilization, we find not only the handbag symbol, but the serpent dragon god of Quetzalcoatl. Now, what's important about that is that not only does it show the connection to ancient Sumer, but the depictions of the Olmec and their giant head statues, some of which are more than 50 tons each, show very African-like features. Now, remember my description just now of the Dogon in Mali, Africa. Instead of a Bering Sea migration route for a lot of these cultures around the world, it seemed that they had seafaring technology and were simply traveling all around the planet. Meaning that if the Dogon had the same knowledge and influences of the Nommo, and we find the same depictions across the ocean with the Olmec that have African-like features, it showed that those two areas were once connected. Not only that, but the Dogon of Mali, Africa, say that all of their knowledge and their original culture had migrated from Egypt long ago, showing us that Egypt and Sumer played major roles in all of the rise and fall of these civilizations around the world. Because remember, these Anunna dragon serpent gods and these eagle gods, they all came from that region, and they all played a part in this struggle around the world, with some creating civilizations and others destroying them. And that's the part of this I want you to remember. Let's return to that struggle, the War of the Serpent and Eagle that I discussed in a previous episode, because that's where all of this comes into play, where we can understand how all these influences came into how our history was written. Traveling back to the Americas, let's go back to the Aztec and Maya region. Now, if you look at the history books, you'll learn that Cortez came over from the Spanish with the symbol of the eagle and phoenix and conquered the Maya and the Aztec. Now, how could he have done that? Looking at the history books, you'll find that he only had a couple hundred men, up against, at the time, the Aztec Empire was the largest army empire of the world. And yet he was able to conquer them. How did he do that? The story is fascinating because what you learn is that the original creator god of the Aztec, known as Quetzalcoatl, was prophesied to return at a certain time period in history. So is it any coincidence that Cortez returned precisely at that prophesied time that Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return? But this only opens up more questions and has us understand who these ancient teachers were. Because the way it's described is that Moctezuma, who was the ruler of the Aztec, mistook Cortez for being the returning Quetzalcoatl. It means that Quetzalcoatl didn't actually look like a serpent dragon god, but was actually a Caucasian male that was traveling from the ancient Sumerian Fertile Crescent region. He's actually described by the indigenous cultures as having a long white beard and a cloak. That's the exact same depiction that's also given for Viracocha as well as Kukulkan. It means that they were the same teachers that had traveled around the world. And when we return to ancient Sumer, we find there was a group known as the Seven Apkallu. They were traveling all around the world and spreading knowledge and creating civilizations. So what I've connected to try to understand this is that Enki and Thoth must have had ancient secret societies and mystery schools that were disseminating the knowledge all around the world, and they were shared by the same influences and same beings. Now, getting back to Moctezuma and the story of the Aztec, Cortez returns precisely when Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return. That's not a coincidence by any means. It means that the Spanish Empire knew that story, and they knew that the only way they could conquer that region of the Americas was to pretend that they were the dragon serpent god Quetzalcoatl. And that's exactly what Cortez did. He pretended he was that god, and then he captured Moctezuma and held him ransom, and that's the only reason they were able to conquer the Aztec Empire. So looking back at all of this, it really highlights and emphasizes that this ancient war of the serpent and dragon versus the eagle and the phoenix has been ongoing throughout history, and it's been used as a tool to conquer other civilizations and destroy them. Imagine for a moment what happens when an empire takes over another region. They put their flag down, they destroy all the remaining evidence of that civilization, and they create their civilization on top of it. That's exactly what we find with the eagle symbols across flags and crests of these empires around the world. They conquered and destroyed the serpent civilizations, and then made their empire dominate on top of the other one, so that our confusion was that we didn't understand where the original source was in the very beginning. The original sages and teachers that traveled around the world in the hope that these civilizations would be created in purity and balance, in order for us to understand our path to reach higher states of ascension. That was the legacy they wanted to leave behind, and that's the legacy we can't forget. Thank you for watching this episode of Mystery School of Truth. In the next episode, we'll be discussing the spectacular sunken ruins discovered off Cuba, and how it closely resembles other megalithic structures around the world, such as in Mexico and Egypt. But the real question is, could this be part of the remnants of Atlantis?